The Science Salon podcast. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. I'm recording this on Wednesday, December 16th. We'll post this on the last week of 2020, the most momentous year probably of my life, and probably within at least half a century going back. And I thought for this one I would do a reading of an essay I wrote called The Aftertime, The Future of Civilization After COVID-19, which was published in this journal, The American Scholar. The one that was published in here is a shorter version of that I'm going to read here. By the way, you notice the cover story is not COVID, but the problem with whiteness. So let me make a few comments before I do this reading about race in America. This is the other big momentous movement of 2020 was the Black Lives Matter movement. And I've addressed this just briefly. I had one episode on the subject of race in America when I had Shelby Steele on the podcast last month. So you can look that up in our archives. He has a new book out called Shame, and then a documentary on what really killed Michael Brown. But he's more famously known for the author of this book, The Content of Our Character, which I read in 1990 when it came out, and that was a game changer for me. And many of the issues he brings up there are still with us, actually even worse in many cases. He's a conservative black commentator and writer and scholar, as he's characterized as a black conservative, like that needs qualification, which is still, I think, part of the problem. And so I haven't written anything extensive on race since the Black Lives Matter movement began, in part because I haven't had time to read a lot of the literature. So I've started to read some of the books that are on the New York Times bestseller list. For example, I just read Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, and Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. So I'll comment more on those later. I want to write it down first and think about their ideas. But my first impressions are, first, because I'm not a black guy, I really don't know what it's like to have these experiences that they recount in their books. Both books are mostly anecdotal driven. There's studies presented about what racism causes in people's lives, physiologically, health-wise, income, lifestyle, and so forth. No question there's issues there to be dealt with. But the actual feeling you get when somebody discriminates against you because of your skin color, obviously I can't identify with that as a white guy. This is supposedly my white privilege. I haven't thought this through completely, but my initial impression is it's not privilege that I have being a white person. It's that I don't have the kind of oppressive mechanisms that race has caused over the centuries of people to hold them back. In other words, I'm not handed anything for free by being a white guy. I'm just not restricted from what I could do because I don't have black skin, whereas black people historically have. That has changed a lot. And the concern I have about both of these books, more generally, is that the entire lens through which they see American culture, society, politics, economics, and especially history is through race. And no doubt that's been a role. But I've also been reading other books which have a rather different perspective. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to read White Fragility, this kind of self-flagellation by whites I just can't stand. But I read J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, for example, now a big hit Netflix film. And Tara Westover's Educated, and Megan Phelps Roper's Unfollow, a memoir of loving and leaving the Westboro Baptist Church, and Amber Scora's book, Leaving the Witness, Exiting a Religion and Finding a Life. These books are not about race at all. They're memoirs of growing up, either in the case of J.D. Vance in Hillbilly Country, or in the case of the other authors, Tara Westover, Megan Phelps Roper, and Amber Scora, pretty much with no education at all, or such crappy education because it was corrupted by religion. Race isn't the problem at all. It doesn't even exist in their lives. And yet they still have other problems that have to be dealt with. And of course, through their lens, they see American culture, society, politics in a completely different light. And so those, I hate to use this expression, lived experience, because it means whatever I think is true for a lot of people. But my point is that, you can look at America through the lens of race, yes, but you can also look at it through the lens of education or class, these class struggles or the influence of religion. So a couple other podcast guests I've had, Catherine Stewart's book, The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, or Andrew Seidel's The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American. Here you see both religion then tied to nationalism as the problem of America. Again, race has nothing to do with it. And in those two cases, class has nothing to do with it. Then I read Barry Weiss's book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism. Of course, Barry here has identified yet another historical problem that has gotten much better, but there's a little uptick in anti-Semitism and hate crimes against Jews in the last 2 years or so that she writes about. Again, the stories are all true, and her account is veridical in that sense, but it has nothing to do with race. All right. Or George Will's The Conservative Sensibility, or Charles Krauthammer's The Point of It All and Things That Matter. These are all books I read last year. And here, their perspective, they're both conservative authors. And their perspective is that the problem with America is the wrong values, too much far left liberal, progressively liberal, illiberal, as they would probably say, values that are corrupting things. It's not race, it's not class, it's not religion, it's this other thing, right? Or finally, Robert Frank's Under the Influence and Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. Here, these are economists talking about income inequality as a problem. So again, it's not race, class, religion, democracy, or conservatism or liberalism. It's income, it's economics that matters. So in response to the Black Lives Matter movement, do Black Lives Matter? Yes, of course, Black Lives Matter. And maybe the better phrase would be Black Lives Matter too, or Black Lives Matter also, just like all lives matter. You can't even use these phrases because they're all loaded, and people are prepared to jump on all over you if you use the wrong words. But you see my point is that all these authors have different perspectives. And so while I understand why Isabel Wilkerson would think America is a caste system comparable to India's caste system, if I were her, maybe I'd think that. I don't know. But if I was one of these other authors, I'd probably think along the lines that they do as well. So we all have, again, that lived experience in America that's different. And so it's, when you say there's a problem in America, we're going to have an overdeterminism of any particular theory of what the problem is. And then on top of all that for 2020 is, COVID. So I will get to hopefully have a couple of these authors on. I've reached out to the publicists of Isabel Wilkerson and Ibram Kendi. I'd say it's a long shot that I'll be able to get them on the podcast, but it's worth a try. And if nothing else, I'll probably eventually write something about that. But for the rest of this episode, I want to read this essay about COVID, because that's the biggest thing that's happened in 2020, and again in all of our lifetimes, the worst pandemic in a century. So my essay is called The Aftertime, The Future of Civilization After COVID-19. As I write in the waning weeks of 2020, it often feels like our civilization has metamorphized into a Herman Melville novel in which, quote, all that most maddens and torments, all that stirs up the lees of things, all truth with malice in it, all that cracks the sinews and cakes the brain, all the subtle demonisms of life and thought, all evil to crazy Ahab, were visibly personified and made practically assailable in Moby Dick. He piled upon the whale's white hump the sum of all the general rage and hate felt by his whole race from Adam down, and then, as if his chest had been a mortar, he burst his hot heart's shell upon it. Who would not be maddened and tormented by the images and stories coming out of intensive care units, where COVID-19 patients gasp out their final breaths as loved ones watch through transparent but impenetrable barriers, unable even to bid a final farewell? It's been a year like no other in my 66 trips around Saul, and there may not be another like it for a century. What it means for us today is apparent enough through the daily news coverage of these scourges, isolated in our thoughts, our voices masked, our social movements spaced apart. But as we peer into the distant horizon, the scene becomes misty, clarity clouded in the fog of uncertainty. What will 2020 mean in 2030, 2050, 2120? Who knows? Even super forecasters, trained in the dark arts of Bayesian reasoning and big data analysis, do no better than chance more than 5 years out. And I'm no super forecaster. I'm the bumper sticker slogan I saw in a car parked in front of the Dayton County Courthouse where John T. Scopes was tried in 1925 for teaching evolution. Militant agnostic, I don't know, and you don't either. Tasked with forecasting the future of our civilization, I feel like Will and Ariel Durant, who, in summing up their 11-volume story of civilization in one short volume, began, "It is a precarious enterprise, and only a fool would try to compress 100 centuries into 100 pages of hazardous conclusions." We proceed. The before time. In a 1966 episode of Star Trek titled Miri, the prepubescent heroine of the story explains to a flummoxed Captain Kirk what happened on her planet when all the grups, grown-ups, were dead, leaving the onlys, children, to fend for themselves. That was when they started to get sick in the before time. We hid, then they were gone. As the linguist Ben Zimmer tracks the phrase's etymology, the before time represents a pre-plague world, and the expression has a deep literary history at least as old as the King James Bible, 1611, in which the author of the Book of Samuel writes, in 1 Samuel 9:9, "Before time in Israel, when a man went to inquire of God, thus he spake, Come, and let us go to the seer. For he that is now called a prophet was before time called a seer." The locution was resurrected in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, as tracked by the Atlantic columnist Marina Coran. Quote, "The exasperated sense that the days before the coronavirus swept across the country, the before time, as many have taken to calling it, feel like a bygone era." If there is a before time describing a pre-post apocalyptic world, there is an after time onto which we may prophesize what happens after the world ends. It's not just a realm for techno-utopians to paint a blissful world in which, in the prophecy of Transhumanist Manifesto, we envision the possibility of broadening human potential by overcoming aging, cognitive shortcomings, involuntary suffering, and our confinement to planet Earth. Nor is it restricted to dystopians who, like Ted Kaczynski, hold that, quote, "The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race, so that when and if the system collapses, the remnants will be smashed beyond repair, so that the system cannot be reconstituted." Although troubling times like the 1860s, the 1960s, and today are often tagged as apocalyptic, inasmuch as the word is often employed in the popular imagination as the complete and final destruction of the world, its original Greek meaning was revelation, or an unveiling or unfolding of things not previously known, and which could not be known apart from the unveiling. It is in this sense that I want to turn our gaze toward what this period may unveil if we can see through the barriers blocking such prognostication. Super forecasting COVID-19. Despite the endless punditry in the media about how the pandemic is going to change society, no one really knows, not even the preternaturally prescient Anthony Fauci. Much depends on how the virus that causes COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, coronavirus 2, evolves, either mutating into or being selected for a less virulent strain, or, less likely, an even deadlier variety than what we experienced in the first half of 2020, which is still far less lethal than smallpox or Ebola. So far, the virus has had few genetic changes since it first emerged in December 2019, which is good news for vaccine developers. From an evolutionary perspective, it's better for the virus that it not kill its host too quickly before they can spread it to other hosts, and that also appears to be happening as more people are being infected but remain symptom-free for weeks as they spread the virus to others, and death rates per infection appear to be declining, although that could change. When the new vaccines are fully produced and distributed globally to billions of people within the first 6 months of 2021, then it is possible life could return to relative normalcy. And there are good reasons to think that this might happen, given the number of government agencies and public and private corporations working on it. And parenthetically, as we've seen last week, this is already unfolding right now. How much should we fear COVID-19? On the one hand, it appears to be far less deadly than the 1918 Spanish flu that infected 500 million people worldwide and killed 50 million of them, for a death rate of 10%. On the other hand, the World Health Organization estimates that around 1 billion people get the flu annually worldwide, killing anywhere from 290,000 to 650,000 each year, for a death rate range from 0.029% to 0.065%, far lower than COVID-19. As of November 23, 2020, confirmed COVID-19 cases globally total 58,766,000, killing 1.4 million of them, for a death rate of 2.36%. I'm about as healthy as a 66-year-old can be, with no pre-existing conditions, a healthy diet, a daily workout routine, and a lifetime of serious athletics, and there is no way I want to risk getting infected with SARS-CoV-2. I socially isolate a lot, socially distance when I go out, and I wear a mask when I'm not exercising. I do this not only for my own safety's sake, but for that of my fellow humans, especially those who are the most vulnerable among us. The old, overweight, infirm, and those with pre-existing conditions like heart disease or diabetes. Many people seem to think that if they don't have one or more of these pre-existing conditions, that they'll be fine contracting the SARS-CoV-2 virus, arguing that those people died because of these other conditions, not COVID-19, with conspiracy theorists falsely claiming that medical professionals get paid more if they record the cause of death as COVID. But in a counterfactual determination of causality, what we want to know is this: would those people with pre-existing conditions have died that day had they not contracted the virus? No. Ergo, it was COVID-19 that killed them. In the law, this is called the but-for test of determination of causal guilt. For example, but for the defendant's act, would the harm have occurred? But for COVID-19, would these people still be alive? That is, but for COVID-19. Yes. Sure, they would eventually likely die earlier than people without those pre-existing conditions, but in determining how deadly COVID-19 is, a counterfactual model such as this, along with the fact that a great many people are dying of COVID-19 who have no pre-existing conditions, should be a strong signal in the causality noise that the virus should be avoided if at all possible. Impediments to projecting the aftertime. There are at least 4 reasons why predictions are so hard to make, especially about the future, as Niels Bohr, Mark Twain, Samuel Goldin, Yogi Berra, and others are alleged to have quipped. The first is the availability heuristic, which holds that we assign probabilities of potential outcomes based on examples that are immediately available to us, especially if they are emotionally salient and easy to visualize. Your estimation of the probability of dying in a plane crash, or lightning strike, shark attack, killer storm, terrorist attack, etc., will be directly related to the availability of just such an event in your world, especially your exposure to it in the media. If newspapers cover an event, people tend to overestimate the probability of that event happening. The hour-by-hour coverage of COVID-19, while responsible and welcome, is likely to distort our projection of its future effects on civilization. A second problem for prophecy underlies the first, and that is we evolved a negativity bias that directs our attention to negative stimuli more than positive. Progress is slow, steady, and incremental, whereas regress can come about in one colossal calamity. Think of the decade of modest but steady economic growth since 2008 recession that was erased in a matter of weeks once the world went into social isolation in response to COVID. In the world in which our ancestors evolved their cognition and emotions that we inherited, entropy dictated that there were many more ways for things to go bad than turn good. So our modern psychology is tuned to a world that was more dangerous in our evolutionary past than it is today. Thus, bad is stronger than good, as the psychologists Roy Baumeister and his colleagues discovered in a paper of that title. Specifically, losses hurt twice as much as gains feel good. Bad impressions and negative stereotypes form faster and are more resistant to change than positive ones. Memory recall is better for bad behaviors, events, and information than it is for good. Negative stimuli have a stronger influence on neural activity than positive stimuli. Losing money and friends has a greater impact on people than gaining money and friends. Criticism and negative feedback hurts more than praise and positive feedback feels good. The negative media coverage generated by COVID-19, however justified, nevertheless cannot help but trigger our negativity bias, clouding rational thinking about these issues. A third impediment to prediction was identified by Philip Tetlock and Dan Gardner in their book Super Forecasting: The Art and Science of Prediction, in which most so-called experts were no better than dart-tossing monkeys when their predictions were checked. When asked to make specific predictions, for example, will Russia annex additional Ukraine territory in the next 3 months? Or will another country exit from the EU in the next 2 years? And their prognosticating feet were held to the empirical fire, Tetlock and Gardner found that most experts were overconfident. After all, they're experts, encouraged by the lack of feedback on their accuracy. If no one reminds you of your misses, you'll only remember the hits, the confirmation bias, and are victims of all the cognitive biases and illusions that plague the rest of us. Even worse, the vast majority of people commenting on what COVID-19 may mean for the future are not even super forecasters. A fourth hindrance to prognostication is the fact that the world is highly contingent and chaotic in the nonlinear sense, and at certain inflection points when necessitating forces hang in the balance, can be nudged out of one pathway into another by seemingly small and random events. But at other times, necessitating forces have dug such a deep trench of momentum that contingent forces are unable to knock them up the steep walls of inevitability. In 1995, I worked out a model that attempts to explain how and when contingencies and necessities interact. In short, I argued that contingencies are the sometimes small and often unexpected events in life. The kingdom hangs in the balance awaiting a horseshoe nail, by the familiar idiom, whereas necessities are the large and powerful laws of nature and trends of history. Once the kingdom has begun to collapse, the arrival of 1,000,000 horseshoe nails will not save it. History is an interaction of such contingencies and necessities, and so I defined contingent necessity as a conjuncture of events compelling a certain course of action by constraining prior conditions. In this, what I called the model of contingent necessity, I concluded, in the development of any historical sequence, the role of contingencies in the construction of necessities is accentuated in the early stages and attenuated in the later. Let me unpack that mouthful. At the beginning of a historical sequence, actions of the individual elements, atoms, molecules, organisms, people, are chaotic, unpredictable, and have a powerful influence on the future development of that sequence. This is the oft-cited butterfly effect. But as the sequence gradually evolves and the pathways become more worn, the chaotic system self-organizes into an orderly one. the individual elements sort themselves and are sorted into their allotted positions as dictated by what came before, with the conjuncture of events compelling a certain course of action by constraining prior conditions. A bifurcation in the sequence may be any stimulus that causes a shift from the dominance of necessity and order to the dominance of contingency and chaos in a historical sequence, which might be anything from an asteroid impact, in the case of the dinosaurs, to pandemics and war, in the case of the Spanish flu and the First World War, to a pandemic, in the case of COVID-19. But such triggers of change will not cause a shift at just any point in the sequence, but only when well-established necessities have been challenged by others so that a contingency may push the sequence into a new direction. What we're interested in knowing here is whether the events of 2020 constitute a powerful contingent nudge of necessitating forces that knock society into entirely new pathways, or if the contingencies will be washed over by the necessitating tides of history and will continue on business as usual. I predict it will be a blending of both, a quantitative change within prevailing systems that will bring about qualitatively noticeable changes, after which society will be healthier and safer. Here are some of the ways civilization may change. Economics and business. The economy will recover sooner if not later, as has happened after every depression or recession in history. And if the stock market is any indication, the economy will snap back robustly. Runaway inflation from printing nearly $2 trillion could take a toll on the economy in coming years, but it won't destroy it. As Adam Smith famously replied to a friend who worried that American independence might ruin Britain's economy, quote, "There's a great deal of ruin in a nation." Universal Basic Income, UBI, heretofore a fringe idea, was single-handedly put on the map by Andrew Yang during his presidential campaign. And although at the time, late 2019, few could conceive of how the government could possibly start dispersing checks to those in need, in a matter of months, that's exactly what the government did, to the tune of $1.8 trillion for the COVID-19 CARES Act relief bill. Depending on the economic outcome of the bill, it is likely to be held up as a model for what can be done in this space. Businesses and entire industries that were already on the margin may never recover, including small colleges and universities without a robust endowment, mid-sized churches and other places of worship, smaller newspapers, magazines, and other media companies, and of course, department stores and many retail outlets who shuttered during the pandemic and never reopened. Although hard on the individuals directly affected, this is not an altogether bad thing for long-term economic health. Joseph Schumpeter's creative destruction on steroids. Amazon has capitalized on this process enthusiastically, and when new markets open up, competition steps in, and we're already seeing more online retailers cutting into Mr. Bezos' empire, such as Costco and Walmart. Meanwhile, abandoned department stores, malls, and other buildings could be converted to warehouses, storage units, facilities for fitness, medical centers, museums, and even apartments and condominiums. Business travel will probably decline, replaced by teleconferencing. Why schlep your atoms around the world when your virtual self can cover most of what constitutes communication? Entry and regulatory barriers for this new demand of an existing technology should decrease as more of our lives move online. Yes, some business needs to be done face-to-face, but more time home and less time on the road could lead to healthier bodies, relationships, and families. More time at home means more home improvement business, from maintenance to remodeling, thereby continuing the building boom of the past decade, along with the do-it-yourself movement helping to fill the coffers of big chains like Home Depot and Lowe's. More at-home time will mean more takeout, pickup, and home delivery of meals that can not only bolster the bottom line of struggling restaurants, but could relieve the daily grind of home meal preparation. Airbnb rentals could continue to increase as hotel stays decline, and staycations, vacations spent close to home, may become even more popular as people explore their local environs, which could also enhance the quality and maintenance of local public gardens, parks, and recreation spaces. As well, the 650% increase in RV rentals during the pandemic could rejuvenate a slagging industry at all levels of the chain. Marriage, dating, sex, and home life. The option to work at home has not been this available since medieval craftsmen fashioned products out of their domiciles. Not only will no one miss sitting in soul-crushing traffic for hours a day, gender roles could become more fluid and balanced with more fathers working from home that gives them more exposure to their children and thus providing more childcare options for both parents. For those not so partnered but desirous to be so, dating has already changed dramatically, and some of those changes might stick, such as more careful screening of suitable candidates through online dating apps. As for sex, casual or otherwise, the trend lines were already moving in the direction of less sex for millennials than Gen Xers and baby boomers. So it's reasonable to project that Gen Xers, or iGeners, those born after 1995, will push the trend even further in the direction of greater sexual discretion. Reading, journaling, meditation, yoga, walking, hiking, cycling, swimming, and other solo activities, all of which are good for physical and mental health and fitness, are already on the increase and could continue as temporary trends become habits. With more people staying in the suburbs, the exodus out of dense city centers could continue the gentrification of large swaths of society. Surely a salubrious shift on so many levels, from health to pollution. Education. Educational institutions, along with the students and parents who support them, will adopt many of the already existing online technologies and content that constitutes knowledge transfer from one mind into many. All 15 of my lectures for my Chapman University Skepticism 101 course, for example, are now available for free for anyone in the world to watch. Why pay tens of thousands of dollars to Harvard when you can take Steven Pinker's course on rationality for free? Multiply this by thousands and add it to all the free online university courses developed over the past decade, plus private educational businesses like the Great Courses, and of course many popular podcasts, some of whose reach was already in the many millions, and becoming an autodidact has never been easier or cheaper. Admittedly, video conference discussions are no substitute for in-class conversations that ricochet around the room guided by nonverbal cues, and lab classes and the like will almost by necessity need to be done in person. So some hybrid solutions are likely to emerge. But perhaps the bloated budgets and corresponding tuition hikes of higher education will be curtailed as disgruntled students and parents vote with their dollars for more economical educational choices. Telemedicine, virtual reality, and other online tools will by necessity and in time, by desire and design, be utilized even more by medical personnel and patients now than they were being tested in this time of crisis. And I don't imagine anyone will miss the wasted time and energy of driving to medical centers, parking, walking, checking in, and especially waiting many minutes, sometimes hours, for a brief medical consultation. Obviously, much of medicine cannot be done remotely, but the burden relief on both ends of the doctor-patient relationship will surely be utilized going forward. Politics and society. Political polarization seemed to decrease for the first couple of months of the pandemic, but as the summer months approached and the looming November presidential election returned to the newsfeed, we returned to where we were at the end of 2019, peak polarization that began in the 1990s. Some historical studies show that many people and nations become more united when confronting a common enemy, as during the Nazi Blitz against Britain, which not only failed to disrupt the lives of the English, but unified them even more. But that's not always the case, so it remains to be seen if COVID-19 brings us together or drives us further apart. Francis Fukuyama suggests 3 elements that could determine this outcome. Quote, a competent state apparatus, a government that citizens trust and listen to, and effective leaders. Time will tell. Virtual Congress, senators and representatives conducting their official congressional business remotely from their homes rather than in Washington, D.C., will not only better serve the people they represent, it will reduce the governmental waste spent on traveling, housing, and all the rest that goes into the current system. Electronic voting. It's time. Trillions of dollars are transacted every year electronically, and although fraud exists, it isn't enough to torpedo business and force economic transactions to return to paper only. Signed ballots? No problem. Electronic signatures on contracts is now the norm. If you can secure a loan, buy a home, invest in businesses and the stock market all via electronic signatures, surely casting a vote in an election should be child's play for programmers. If Russian and Chinese hackers have not tanked the U.S. economy remotely, our elections should be safe. Movie theaters could go the way of drive-in theaters in the 1990s, whose popularity waned as home entertainment systems came online. Today, with a plethora of cheap online streaming services and high-def big-screen TVs, why leave home to sit in a crowded theater with coughing and sneezing viewers? And microwave popcorn is pretty tasty and a lot cheaper. And wouldn't you know it, drive-in theaters are making a comeback around the country. As people want to get out of the house but remain safely ensconced in their cars, with food vendors selling burgers, hot dogs, and sushi, and venues selling out in minutes after announcing film and music events. A healthier balance between individual freedom and collective action could develop. Many Americans seem to think that wearing a mask infringes on their freedom, although they don't seem to object to being forced to driving on the left side of the highway or to restaurants requiring shoes and shirts for service. The freedom to swing your fist ends at my nose. You're free to smoke, but you're not free to blow it in my face. You're free to risk contracting COVID-19, but I should be free from your germs. We routinely give up freedom for security. Thomas Hobbes explained why 3.5 centuries ago. So-called social contract. Personal and public health. Bars, restaurants, nightclubs, nail and hair salons, sports stadiums, and other high social density venues may continue practicing reasonable hygienic measures without too much pushback from customers. Although tight cultures like Germany and Japan will have an easier time of it than loose cultures like Italy and the United States, where citizens are less inclined to follow norms of order in times of crisis, as tracked by the cultural psychologist Michelle Gelfand. Gun sales spiked during COVID-19, with March 2020 peaking at 2 million gun purchases, the second highest ever, as people express fear that the pandemic could lead to civil unrest. This will likely not continue as fears subside, and after all previous spikes, for example, after the January 2012 spike following President Obama's re-election and the Sandy Hook shooting, when fears of gun restrictions rose, panicked buying wanes and people's fears are directed elsewhere. Nevertheless, gun violence remains a problem in the U.S., and that isn't going to go away after COVID-19 and could possibly become worse, as I predicted in 2017 after the Las Vegas massacre. Handshakes are out and will likely remain so, replaced by fist bumps, elbow taps, and maybe even something like the Japanese bow or yoga namaste acknowledgement greeting. This is a cost-free, easy-to-implement norm change that may reduce the number of common colds, flus, and other communicable diseases that we all experience and could further decrease the average human body temperature from the previously common figure of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Say what? In January 2020, researchers at the Stanford University School of Medicine published a study adjusting the old standard of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, established by the German physician Karl Reinhold August Wunderlich in 1868, to the new lower figure of 97.9 degrees Fahrenheit, based on the average temperature of 25,000 British patients. led by Stanford's Julie Parsonet, a professor of medicine and of health research and policy. The team analyzed temperatures from 3 data sets. 1, military service records from the Union Army veterans from the Civil War between 1862 and 1930, N of 23,710. 2, data from the U.S. National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey from 1971 to 1975, N of 15,301. And 3, adult patients who visited Stanford Healthcare between 2007 and 2017, an N of 150,280. The study compared a total of 677,423 temperature readings from all 3 data sets, concluding that the average body temperature of men born between mid-1990s is on average 1.06 degrees Fahrenheit lower than men born in the early 1800s, and that the body temperature of women born in the early to mid-1990s is on average 0.58 degrees Fahrenheit lower than that of women born in the 1890s. The researchers conclude that the shift is not due to measurement error corrections, but rather reflect a true historical pattern of changes in our environment and lifestyle over the past 157 years. Our bodies are getting cooler because we're getting sick less often. Quote, change in the population level of inflammation seems the most plausible explanation for the observed decrease in temperature over time, the researchers concluded. Quote, economic development, improved standards of living and sanitation, decreased chronic infections from war injuries, improved dental hygiene, the waning of tuberculosis and malaria infections, and the dawn of the antibiotic age together are likely to have decreased chronic inflammation since the 19th century. It is entirely possible that as a result of COVID-19, we will become even healthier and cooler than any time in history. Prescriptions and descriptions. It may seem overly melioristic to spend so many changes in a positive direction as COVID-19 continues ravaging populations, and ICUs and morgues are overflowing. But with history as our guide and rational forecasting as our method, what I have outlined here may not be entirely off the mark. As such, I have consciously avoided being overly influenced by the availability heuristic, tried to keep my negativity bias in check, utilize the tools of super forecasting, and considered to what extent the contingencies brought about by this pandemic could nudge or knock necessities into new and, hopefully, more positive directions. I do not think that anything that has happened thus far will trigger a change in society so dramatic that it will constitute something like a major revolution in the history of civilization. Protopia, not utopia or dystopia. Well, thanks for listening. I'm Michael Shermer, and this is the Science Salon podcast, and I hope you had a good and safe 2020, and we'll continue to do so in 2021, and I'm looking forward to all of us reaching herd immunity through vaccines and otherwise, and we can carry on solving other social problems. Thanks for listening.